All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. In the interest of getting started on time, I'm going to get us going, but I know there's some more people trickling in. But to get us started, my name's Taylor. I am the Policy and Program Staff Attorney with the Center for Human Rights and Constitutional Law. Today, we are doing a CLE training on Don't Surrender the Narrative, Reclaiming Legislative Intent Through Effective Legislative Research. If you are in California and you provided your bar number, you will get CLE credit for that from us. And we will provide a certificate of participation to attorneys in all other states. That will go up out in follow-up materials, which I will send out in an email after this presentation, usually within a few days. We will include a copy of the recording for this as well as the slides themselves, so you will get those. Just some housekeeping questions to go into the Q&A today, not the chat. And I have here assisting wonderful team members of mine, both Karen and Lillian. They will be putting information into the chat. If there's anything, you need to know, that information is there from them. But your questions should go into the Q&A, and I will try to get to questions at the end today. And just as a heads up, I'm going to be doing a lot of screen sharing today so that I can actually show you how to move through this. So hopefully I've practiced, everything goes good between the screen sharing, but please have a little patience with me as I maneuver between screens in the PowerPoint so I can get you the most practical experience today. So let's get started. So I guess to ground us all, I think, why legislative research? Why do we need to be doing this when, yes, textualism rules the day? And we know that when we're writing briefs and we're presenting things to the court, right? But I think we, as public interest attorneys specifically, often know that a piece of legislation's overarching purpose matters. Is its purpose to protect people, to provide benefits, security, right? We know that intuitively. Um, and these people exist on courts too. They're also judges, even if it's true that textualism is kind of the dominating form of interpretation. Um, and so, as attorneys, we actually have to try to give them that a story and that material to use, right? It's harder for them to use that context if we don't even include it. And so, I want to encourage us all today to think about how we can continue to reclaim that purpose and put that into our arguments. It's not the whole story, right? It's one form of interpretation. Um, but if we don't give it to judges, they don't have anything to use there. So um, it's behoove of us when we see that purpose to help judges see that as well. Um, and even though textualism is so dominant today, this purpose, this context, this legislative history is still relevant. The Supreme Court in Allen v. Milligan in June of 2023, the court set aside Alabama's congressional districting law as violating the Voting Rights Act. And while this opinion included plenty of textualist argument, it also did talk about the history and purpose of the Voting Rights Act. The court looked at Reconstruction and the Jim Crow history, and they specifically discussed the legislative history that led Congress to include discriminatory impacts rather than just intentional discrimination. So even if we feel like this isn't as dominant of a mode, it does still matter. It is still being used, even if less so. And when we include this narrative, it encourages judges that it is still a valid form of interpretation, which historically it was and is. And also, in the world that we live in today, we see that media is talking about decisions, talking about briefs that are being filed. And as lawyers, we can also think about how are we framing that narrative for the people, the reporters who are trying to tell these stories, specifically when we're addressing harm, right? When we include that in our briefs, in our arguments, it makes that narrative that we see more accessible to the public as well. And so that's another way to think about the importance of this. So, so our agenda today, we're going to look at what is a purpose-based approach to interpretation. We're going to review what is legislative history. We're going to discuss where do you go for legislative history. We're going to walk through some examples. We're going to discuss comparing versions of bills. Finally, there's a slide with a bunch of resources that I hope will be helpful. Then we'll take some questions at the end. So, to ground us, what is a purpose-based approach to interpretation? And this essentially, there's a really good quote from Justice Frankfurter that I put in here, essentially that laws are not abstract propositions. They're expressions of policy arising out of specific situations and addressed to the attainment of particular ends. And this is what legislative history helps inform, right? And so when you're interpreting, you're looking at what is the purpose, and part of determining that is that legislative history. So a purpose-based approach seeks to advance congressional purposes. Why was the law passed? What did Congress care about, right? Why these words? What purpose do the words or the provision serve broadly? What is the mischief trying to be solved? And then taking that and thinking about how do different interpretations further or create an obstacle to achieving those purposes that Congress envisioned. Um, Justice Breyer has a book on purpose-based approach, which is I would recommend if you're interested in thinking about this more. But he frames it as what would a reasonable legislator have thought about the matter had the legislator known about and considered the matter at the time of enactment. This isn't perfect, but it is one way of thinking about a form of interpretation. So, what then is legislative history? We are all probably somewhat familiar, but just grounding us basically again, it is a source for finding purpose, not the whole story, one among many. And it commonly includes committee reports, congressional committee hearings, the congressional record, and the congressional record is your transcript of debates for both the House and Senate. And those are typically statements made on the floor. The most important ones are usually those made by a law's primary sponsor or a bill's sponsor because they helped write the bill. And I'm sure many of you are thinking as we're listening to this, there's a lot of criticisms out there about legislative history, how reliable it is, right? And Justice Breyer has a really, I think, kind of a funny response to this criticism. And he says, no one is claiming essentially that the committee report is the law, right? It just helps a judge understand the circumstances that were occurring in the world, right? When that bill was passed, what was being told to other legislators? What did the drafters have in mind? What were they trying to solve? Um, and he says it's one tool among others. And just like all the interpretive tools, of course, it of itself was not enacted into law. And so he says the answer to the argument that Congress did not enact the statute's history into law is a polite, true, but so. Um, and so I want to encourage us to take a little bit of that and think about how we can use this. Sometimes it'll be helpful, sometimes it won't, but it's a tool in the bucket. So now I'll move us to where to go for legislative research. And I'm sure pretty much everyone on this call is familiar with legislative research on Westlaw, legislative research on Lexis. Um, but I think the reason you're here is because you're looking for hopefully more than that. And so I'm going to focus today not on Lexis and Westlaw, because you can usually reach out to Lexis and Westlaw if you have questions about how to access their legislative materials, and you're most likely to be familiar with that. I'm going to try to provide you with more resources that exist and that can be supplementary, helpful, and oftentimes better. So the first service, this one, it's a subscription service. It's called ProQuest Congressional. And if you think back to your law school days, your law librarian probably told you about this, and then you probably never logged in again. Maybe you have, but probably not, especially if you're a nonprofit, attorney. How many subscriptions we pay for is limited, right? Um, but ProQuest Congressional, there's both a base subscription and a full subscription. But it's really, really strong coverage of congressional materials. It includes hearings, reports, serial sets, bills, resolutions, committee prints. It basically has it all. And its coverage is extremely comprehensive. Um, if it's the base model, though, it only has links to selected full text, so the links aren't to everything. The full subscription links to all the core content and has some additional content. Um, Now, one of the things, this is the way I do this research at the center, is I access ProQuest through my local library. I'm in Minnesota, so I use my Hennepin County my library, and they have a subscription that I can use. Um, so if you're thinking to yourself, there's no way I'll ever be able to access this and pay for this, local libraries, they are wonderful. And so I'd encourage you to check your library. And if your library doesn't have it, there's so many libraries that you can get access to, even if you don't live there. So I would look into your access through your local library. One thing I've noticed is that local libraries often don't have a full subscription. They sometimes just have the base subscription. Um, and so if you're running into a situation where you really need the text, you can't find it in any of the other places we're going to talk about, that's a place where you should think about reaching out to your law librarians. Go back to your law school and say, "Hey, alumni here, can you help me get access to something? I've done this." They are wonderful. Your law librarians are phenomenal humans, and they will often help you get access to something that maybe you can't get. Um, it can also be your like state law libraries. Um, but know that those exist. Those essentially that full subscription does exist out there. And often universities and the biggest law libraries have access to that. So if you're running into a place where you don't have access because, it's only selected um, PDF documents in the base one, utilize other resources that you probably haven't thought to go, back to your law school and be like, hey, can you help me out? But I find, at least for me, they've been wonderful resources when I can't get something. Some additional notes on subscription services. Hein Online also has a really phenomenal subscription service for legislative research. They have a congressional documents library, and they have a federal legislative history library. Um, Very comprehensive, also really recommended if you're looking for an alternative. I have on there as well Lexis and Westlaw, obviously. I'm sure you all have done some form of legislative research on those. It's not as comprehensive as ProQuest or Hein Online. And so often you'll find you can't get as far back on the documents, or they aren't covering bills that didn't become law. The legislative history only exists if it actually became law. And you may be thinking, why do I need something that, didn't become law? We'll get there. And then finally, our favorite slide, the free services. Um, there's a few different websites on here. We have congress.gov, govinfo.gov, and the Library of Congress. You wonder why there's a congress.gov and a govinfo.gov, but here we are. They're separate. They have slightly different availability for documents. Um, you know, if you look at this, right, the bills at GovInfo only go back to 1993. For Congress.gov, bills only go back to 1989. And so this is why you're thinking, oh, ProQuest with that much more comprehensive all the way back on bills. And again, I want you to be thinking bills, not law, not just bills that became laws, but all bills. Um, and again, the committee reports. And this information isn't something you need to memorize. Okay, which ones have this? There's a lot of really wonderful law library research guides, and I've attached some of these that have that information if you're ever trying to figure it out, of like, okay, this is the date, who's going to have it. So you don't need to memorize this. Just, tag your favorite research guide from a law library. But these are kind of your primary free services that you're going to be thinking about for doing legislative research. A big takeaway of this is because you saw they all have different dates, right? And some things might have a PDF, a text, some aren't, is that you're likely going to need to use multiple of these resources. And that's especially true for older legislation. Um, I very rarely run into a circumstance where I can use just one of them. It's great if you can, but be prepared and thinking in your head that you might be flipping between these and finding different things on different resources. Um, and I tagged for you here, this is like what I was saying, the Georgetown Legislative History Research Guide has a chart that shows the different types of legislative history and their date range availability and all those resources we just talked about. So you can always go in there to be like, okay, who's going to have it? So you don't have to search everywhere. So now we're going to move into some examples, and I'm going to stop sharing the slideshow and we're going to start actually looking at my web browser and we're going to flip through kind of doing some of this research. We're going to use as an example the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2005, and we're going to start in ProQuest Congressional and see what this would look like. So let me get out of here and get up what we need. Okay. Let me make this full screen. All right. And Karen and Lillian, if for any reason things aren't showing up correctly, if you could just flag it for me, but I think everyone should be able to see now that we have ProQuest Congressional open. And I have keyed in the Violence Against Women Act of 2005, and we can search that. Violence Against Women Act of. And unfortunately, my version consistently makes me accept these cookies every time, but here we are. So you'll see if you scroll down, we've got hearings, CRS reports, House and Senate documents, legislative history. Um, and we can start with the legislative history one. You can also start with one of the actual bill, but it's nice to see if there is a legislative history because some of these have compiled legislative history, some bills do, some don't, but it's nice to start there and we can always link through to the actual bill from there. So we're going to start in this section that says legislative history. We see the Violence Against Women, the Reauthorization Act of 2005. Great. That is what we want. Here is a summary. I want to point you to, this is one of the most important areas is this title info. You'll see here's your title, and then you have, this is the bill that was enacted. Oftentimes we're really focused on what is our public law, right? And here's our public law number. This is information we get really quick on Westlaw or Lexis. But we want to go back and look at the bill. But first I'll just show you really quick what this compiled legislative history looks like. So you can see here, there's debates that you can link through to see all the debates. You can see previous versions of bills that were introduced. Here's some related bills. You've got reports. You've got hearings, right? There's a giant compiled legislative history for here that you can have kind of get right into. But if we're going to go look at the bill, we want to start there. And I think that's a good place. But you're going to use both, but I want to make you familiar. So we're going to go to where it says enacted bill, and here it's 109 HR. So that's a House, started in the House 3402. So we're going to click on retrieve bill profile report. And this gets us to the page for the bill. Up here, you can see that it was introduced, passed in the House, passed in the Senate, signed by the president, and then became law. Some bills you're going to look at and write they didn't become law, and you'll see those aren't checked. Or maybe it only passed the House, didn't pass the Senate. You can see what happened. So up here we have these tabs, the overview, actions, committees, sponsors, related publications, and bill text. The bill text itself is in bill text. But what's super important and really helpful that ProQuest does is if you go to actions, you can see all the actions taken and the dates on the bill. So we can see all the way back here. We have this, it was referred to the House Committee on the Judiciary. And you can see you can click into the Congressional Record. So I'll show you this. We click on this. We would click on this. And here's the text on the exact page for that. Okay, apparently they're making this difficult to go back to. So we'll just go back to, I'll show you that you can search it as well once you have it, the bill number. So I'm putting the bill number in there to search. And you'll see we get right back to it up at the top result. Go back to actions. So this is great because you can link through to all of these and see exactly in the Congressional Record what the debate was, what was that language. And it's really nice to not have to scroll through everything. You can get there kind of quick. You can also see the votes, right? You can see, look here, we have the House passed by 415 yeas to 4 nays. Really easy to get that information. It also shows you here, this is your committee report. This is a House report from the Committee on the Judiciary. Committee reports are kind of of legislative history, the highest ranking in persuasiveness. So those are always really important. So you can see here, we can actually click on the House report. And here is the report. And you can see you have the whole report here. It's great. And the text is there for you for that report. One of the things, so what's also nice is you can see here, it shows specifically remarks by who. So this might be helpful if you're looking for remarks by the sponsor of the bill or co-sponsors of the bill. Or you might know, and you've done some research already, you've started and you're looking for, there's someone who was kind of in opposition. Why were they in opposition? So you could go specifically to that individual. Now, I'll note for you, remember how I said sometimes things are missing. You'll notice here that there's some that aren't linked, right? We have a situation, some of those aren't linked, and that is because the ProQuest version, basic version, doesn't link everything. So some things aren't linked, and I'm going to show you how we go get those in a second. But before I do that, I want to show you that in addition to finding kind of reports on the actions page, there's some other information up here. You can see what committees that the bill went to. Usually committees will release a report. So you can see here, this was referred to the House Committee on the Judiciary. You can also easily see who was the sponsor, who were your co-sponsors. So you can see that information really quick there. And in related publications, this is where you can also see reports as well. So these reports are here. They're also linked there. There's also, you can link into the actual public law. So you can find more links there to other useful materials. But let's go back now to the fact that we are missing essentially some links. And let's say we want to find one of those and it's not here. So what would we do? Well, we're going to go over to, let's get it up. We're going to go over to GovInfo and we're going to look for this. Let's see, we're going to look for this one down here, 8474. So this one's missing on September 28th, 2005. All right, let's say we want to find that. It's not here. So I have teed up for us. We are in GovInfo. Where would we go? We're going to go to, and we're browsing by category. We're going to go to Proceedings of Congress and General Congressional Publications. We're going to go to Congressional Record. And then we know that this is the 100 because the date, let me show you, 151. So that's what you're looking for here is volume 151. Here we are. It was September, so we're going to go down to September. And we're going to, it was September 28th. Go to September 28th. And let's go back and look. It says H, that means it was in the House. If it was the Senate, it would say S. So we want the House section. We would click on this. And then it gave us, back here, it gives us the page number, 8474. That's the page we're missing. And so we would just search that and we would put in 8474 and we would end up on the correct page and you can read it to see what was missing. So that is what we do when something is missing, for example. And this is why I was saying you're going to often need to use more resources, right? This is great though, because it gets you to, okay, at least I know what date something's happening. And you can see, obviously, there's a bunch of September 28th. So obviously there was a lot of debate happening on this day. But that's how to think about using multiple resources. I tend to start with ProQuest because it's going to give me those dates. I can see what is there and then move to kind of going through other resources. And I would say we're going to keep going through some more examples, but before we get in, I will admit a lot of this is somewhat confusing. We're all very comfortable with Westlaw. We know how to move through there quickly. We know how to move through Lexis quickly. And I would encourage you to just spend some time playing around on these websites. You will get more familiar. And I'll also say sometimes they're just bad. And you might think something should exist on one of them. And when that happens, like use Google, just Google like GovInfo, what you're looking for, and see if it comes up. We can all go through the proper things, and sometimes it seems like it's not there, and maybe we're looking in slightly the wrong spot. So don't be afraid to try, especially with GovInfo, congress.gov, to try that Google search for something if it's not coming up. So I'm going to get rid of this now, and we're going to move to our next example. But before I do that, we're going to bring the PowerPoint back up. There are, just so you know, when you get the PowerPoint, you'll see there's some information about how we did that, because I know you're probably going to forget it. It's here, so you'll have some of that information. Our next example is a provision. So I picked a provision that I've done some research on, and I showed you this is what shows on the bottom of that provision on Westlaw, right? You have this giant section of all the citations with the public laws. And what I wanted to point out before we go look at is if you're on Westlaw, you'll see right here, this is the first this 1952 law, there's no public law listed for it. So we're without a public law. You can't click through to this. The next thing we've got is this public law, but that is not this. So this is kind of already pointing to these limitations of some of our legal search engines for legislative research, for legislative history research. So pointing that out to you. And then you'll notice here in the historical notes section for the provision, it lists the 1952 Act. There's a House report and a conference report. The version that I picked doesn't show the links, but that I copied. But if you're in Westlaw, you'd see some of these are highlighted and you could click through. Neither this House report 1365 nor the conference report 2096 can be clicked through in Westlaw. You can't get to those. So you wouldn't even be able to get to the reports from the original kind of law. So that's why I say that some of these other research engines that we're less familiar with become important because unfortunately, Westlaw and Lexis aren't really built for this just legislative history. So we are going to get out of here and I'm going to show you how to do this again. Okay. So let's make this full screen again. All right, so like I said, I normally start at ProQuest. So we have the statutes at large citation. I'm going to type it in and you'll see nothing. Well, that's disappointing. So we have to go somewhere else. We're going to go to GovInfo and we're going to go to the citation section. You're going to select a collection. You'll see I selected statutes at large because that's the citation I have. The volume, that first number is 66, right? So the volume is 66. It's the 82nd Congress, 1952. It matches. We know the law is a 1952 law. And the end of that citation was 233. If we search it, it brings this up and we see that that citation is probably the reason it didn't come up in ProQuest is right because that was just a provision inside this statute that is 66 Stat 163. But now we can open this and we can find what will be a PDF old version of the law. So here's our public law for 414. So now we have this information. We are now going to go back to ProQuest. This is the joy, you're moving between these things. Okay. And now we have our public law number. Okay, so we are going to go to ProQuest and we search the public law 82414 because that's the public law number that we got after we did the search on the statute at large. And this leads us to 82414. Here's the public law itself. And it's a good idea, I think. It doesn't hurt to kind of start there, but you can also see this is the bill for it as well. So that's the public law, that's the bill. We want to go to the bill. I guess we encountered an issue. That's okay. We'll begin a new session. I think it probably doesn't like that I have all of these open. Let's do ProQuest Congressional. There we go. We're back. We're going to search again the public law, 82-414. Here we are. And this one is, we wanted to go to the bill. So this gives us a bill number, but it doesn't let us link through. So we're going to go back. Sometimes that happens on here. It's annoying. That's why I said we want to, on this case, we want to actually click on the bill. Okay. So I want to show you here, again, we have not as much this time, and you'll notice this is an older bill. If you remember the last one, we had a lot more tabs, a lot more information, right? Here we don't. Interestingly, you can see up here at the top, we have it was introduced, passed by the House, passed by the Senate, vetoed by the President, and it looks like House and Senate overrode that veto, passed into law. But what's interesting here is if we go to actions, you can see, wow, there's barely anything, right? We have when it was introduced, referred, we see the veto, we see it became law, and we see that there was that override by Senate before it became law. No links this time. We have some sites, right? But significantly less. And this happens as our laws, as these bills get older, as the laws get older. That's just the unfortunate reality. So I want to encourage, in this case, when you see something like this and you're seeing there's nothing about the debate and stuff like that, but you know this was a big bill, this was a big law. There was definitely debate on it. Unfortunately, this means you're going to have to find these yourself. Um, and so now we're going to go to, instead of GovInfo, I'm going to show you how to use congress.gov just as a change here. But we're going to go look for the Congressional Record because we want to see that debate. We want to see what was said. Um, so we're going to go look for it in congress.gov. So if we're on the congress.gov website, you're going to select Congressional Record. You're going to say search. And you're going to want to change it because this is really long. You're going to change this to the 82nd Congress. As your other select. Okay. Now you can see we have our congressional record for, it's the bound edition all the way back. We know if we go back to this, okay, it was referred on February 14th. So we could look for, go back to February 14th. We'd have to go back even further. April, March, one more. February 14th. Here we go. So there's Senate, we have the Daily Digest, and the House of Reps. This one we're going to go to February 14th for the House of Representatives right here. And then you have this. What you end up having to do once you have these is you have to download them and then you have to search the bill number. In this case, the bill number was, you can search 5678. What gets really frustrating is we have this 14th date. We don't know when the debate happened. So unfortunately, you have to open up every single record for these really old ones and do, control search find for that bill number. And in your head, I know you're thinking, oh my gosh, that could take me forever. Is that really worth it? Well, let me show you, right? This is what it looks like. When I opened everything up between this date to the time it became public law, this is just like an example of mine. These are all the debates and notes on what happened, right? There was a lot discussed. And then it was also made clear in that there were other competing bills at the time. So then you have information to, okay, what were the competing bills? So if you're looking for something and it's important to you, unfortunately, sometimes you have to do that super manual work. The Congress.gov is a little clunkier to me than GovInfo. So I prefer using GovInfo for stuff like this. But sometimes you don't have a choice, right? You're going to be looking at a date and they're all wonky. So sometimes you have to use Congress.gov. Sometimes you can use GovInfo. You will start to find what works best for you. Again, that's where you're going to want to play in these a little more. So the other thing that I want to point out on this, if we go back here, we see that there is some related publications. And this is what I also showed you on Westlaw, right? It did mention that there was a House report. And we see here some reports, and this would be February 14th when it was introduced. It was referred. If you click, what's interesting is I don't really know why there's two of these, but one of them actually has the PDF full text. So here it is. Here's our text of the report. What's odd is the one above looks like it matches exactly, but right here you'll see, so right, we clicked on this one and it linked us to the text. This one is the exact same. If you click on this, for some reason, the link is not there for the text. So I would encourage you to, unfortunately, if something isn't there, don't assume if it wasn't here that it's not in this one. Search engines. The same thing is true, right? There's a duplication of this conference report up here. So I want to talk about like the importance. Why find and hunt down these House reports? You know, it takes time. It takes time to read them. Well, let me bring up this report. This report shows if the provision that we're actually looking for in here is 287. If you read this report, you'll see section 287 on this report is actually showing the proposed law, existing law. So this is the provision that we really started with. We were trying to do the legislative research on. And if you see the existing law, there's two laws mentioned here. This Act of August 7th, 1946, and this February 27th, 1925 law that was amended by the 46 one. That means you have to start all over with your legislative research for these two laws. Why? Because all the debate, all the conversation, all the reports on this specific provision, right, that are basically largely mirroring each other, were on those laws. And this is where, if you think about that Westlaw, right, that all it talked to you about was, okay, you've got that 1952. You're like, okay, if I'm just looking at the 1952, legislative history, I'm done. But the reason it's important to dig into those reports is actually, if you stop at 1952, you're not getting back to the actual debates on the provision. Those were standalone bills prior to that. It's not easy to find in Westlaw. So you have to open up these reports. You'll find things like this. And so actually there's really, and we don't have time to kind of get into it, there's really extensive history and debates and House reports on those two laws specifically relating to this provision that we started with. And so that's kind of the importance of getting back to that. I also just want to flag that if you are looking for the House report, just really quickly, in congress.gov, it's up here in committee materials. You would have to select committee reports, but then you would see committee reports, stop at 19, I'll go back to 1993. So remember I said some of those dates, you couldn't even find this on congress.gov. If you wanted to look on govinfo.gov, you can look at the congressional serial set. That's where reports live, House and Senate reports. This was a House report. We put it in. I put the number in. Not here. Don't know why. It's not. This is what's really frustrating. And this is why it's worth, if you think you can't find something, checking multiple sources, right? This is on ProQuest, not on the two federal government websites. Frustrating, but that's that's how it is. Okay. So we are now I'm going to pull this back up. We talked about kind of the importance of digging back further with those House reports, how it can show, really getting back to what were individual laws before that? What were the bills debated on before that? Finally, we're going to look at kind of comparing versions of bills. And this is something I think sometimes as lawyers we often don't do. We follow just the legislative history of the law that was enacted, and we don't really go further than that. But it's actually really important to compare related bills that are addressing the same topic. This might look like you might have companion bills. It might be the same text in both the House and Senate. So something was introduced, basically mirroring each other, and both bodies are considering it. You might have competing bills at the same time. So you might have the same issue being addressed through, two different lenses. And so you have different provisions, competing provisions on the same topic. You might also have something where you're looking at prior years. A bill was, um, brought forward, it didn't move, there wasn't support for it, and so you try again the next legislative session. And so you can see that same issue then introduced in different years. That means there can be legislative history from those prior introductions, even if that bill wasn't the one that was ultimately enacted, right? And then you also want to be looking at those amendments to the bill prior to passage. What language was changing? Because that can help inform interpretation. If something was rejected as an amendment and, maybe, the other side is essentially arguing that it should be interpreted in a way that would be consistent with that rejected amendment, right? So you want to be really conscious that you're looking at those amendments as well. I'm going to show you as an example of this. We're going to look at the 2013 VAWA reauthorization. See, we're getting lots of VAWA research, and that's because that's what I had to bring. Oops, put this down here. Nope, this one's not the VAWA one. Okay, we are going to now look at VAWA reauthorization 2013. So we'll do this. And you'll see I already hit search on this. We're going to go down to the legislative histories. We're going to select the legislative history for the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2013. So frustrating. Sorry, guys. The library's probably like, why do you have so many tabs open for this? So we're going to go back down where we were to the legislative history, 2013. That's what we want. Remember earlier I showed you and told you there was the section that has bill versions. These are all bills that in some way relate to the content that is in the VAWA reauthorization bill that was ultimately passed. And you can see we've got multiple different, this is right, 113 Senate 47. This is what was ultimately passed. But here's all these competing kind of different ideas, and same session, here's the session before. And so if you're looking at this and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to figure out which of these to look at, right? Time is limited. I would focus on the ones that were introduced, reported, passed, right? At least somewhere. So like this one, Senate 1925, there's multiple pieces of action on that. And if we click onto this one, for example, you'll see, oh, look, this one was a Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2012. Okay, great. That's right on point to what we were wanting to look at. Um, but in comparison, let's say we click on this one. This one's related, but it's not as on point, right? Improving assistance to domestic and sexual violence victims. So it's related, but it's not a duplicate essentially of the exact FAWA reauthorization. So sometimes you have to kind of click through to see which are the ones that are most important for me to compare. Um, what can help you do this is what we all know, which is our secondary resources. Secondary resources that are really helpful in the context of legislative research is CRS reports, and those are in here. So if you're trying to, and you'll see another way actually that you can see kind of what bills were most relevant is if you're looking at this, you can see Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. You can see which ones here that they report for hearings were kind of the closest. So that's another way to kind of narrow down. But what I want to show you is, let's go. Actually, CRS, I think, doesn't show up in here. So you look, if we look at for CRS reports, and I control search find those are not in here. So unfortunately, we have to go back to results. And we still have the same search. We're going to go to CRS reports, and I'm going to say view all 16 results. And because this is a 2013 bill, I would look for, I'm going to sort this. I would look for a 2013 date just to see if there's anything, because that might be the most helpful. This one looks really good. Immigration provisions of the Violence Against Women Act. That's what I would have been looking for. So if I had clicked on this, I can get this text. If you read this, which we're not going to do, right? It ends up identifying that there were four major kind of bills at the time, and they had competing provisions. In fact, really different provisions, some being very restrictive towards immigrants and others not. And so those ones that didn't get passed, they had those restrictive provisions for immigrants. That becomes relevant when you're talking about interpretation because you can show, hey, this was rejected. In fact, this was already looked at. Congress rejected that and they passed this instead. So we shouldn't have an interpretation that looks like the bill that was defeated, right? It's more work because not only are you looking at the legislative history of the bill that did pass, but you're looking at now you have to go look at the legislative history of the bills that failed. But those ones provide a lot of context. Um, they provide context of what was rejected sometimes, and that's just as important for defining how something should be interpreted. So I know that was a lot of information. I tried to show how to find these things. And I know you will be likely being like, how do I go back to this? These resources that I listed, there's some really good research guides on here. There's information on, what are the most important legislative documents? What is their persuasive value? And generally, so there's great resources on here that you can use. And you can also just do some Googling if you're trying to figure out, those. But I would definitely recommend like research guides from law libraries. They're phenomenal. You just have to find the one that works the best for you. And with that, that kind of wraps us up with just a few minutes for questions, which is great. Before I answer questions, flagging that I will follow up an email with all follow-up materials, which will include those CLE certificates. You'll get this recording. You'll also get this PowerPoint with the links. And if you don't receive this within 2 weeks, you can reach out directly to me. But then I'm going to look in the questions and hopefully answer a few of those. So. There's one question in there. It says, is a House report a committee report or a House communication? House report, one of those resources that I connected to you for you actually shows the abbreviations that are used. And this is the usefulness of finding and kind of saving these. There's a lot of different right? The shorthand for what things are. One of those on the resources shows you the shorthand for each kind of like if it's H report or if it's a communication, if it's a conference report. So I just check those when you're trying to figure out what something is and you don't understand the shorthand. There are resources that's like a giant chart for that. Um, Someone asked for congress.gov, what is the difference between daily and bound? Um, Daily is I do not personally know why this happens, but basically, daily is like as it goes, and then it gets turned into a bound version that organizes slightly differently. So it's not as organized by date. It's kind of like topical within it. And so it gets like reorganized. So the bound version is usually slightly behind the daily version. I find it's easiest to use a daily version, frankly, if you're just trying to do the initial research. And then if you find something that you want to use, Blue Book technically says you're supposed to use the bound version for citations. I'm going to be honest, I don't know how much judges actually care if you cited the daily version versus the bound version. I mean, don't do it wrong if you're going to the Supreme Court, but realistically. Um, but the bound version is what you're supposed to cite. ProQuest does help you do that conversion and can help somewhere on there. I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head. Shows you the daily to bound. But I would say if you're doing the research, I think daily is easier. Um, okay. Someone asked, how will I know if the library has a full version of ProQuest versus the basic version? I have been trying to figure that out myself because for the Hennepin one, it shows CRS reports, which is a supposed to be like the additional that's part of like the full version. And yet I still run into things that don't have PDFs. Um, so sometimes I'm like, is it not a full version? I can't find it anywhere on the on ProQuest itself. I've yet to find that because I've been trying to figure it out and thing. You could probably call your library and ask. That's what I would say. But also, I think if you notice that there aren't a lot of PDF links, you're probably working with a basic version. But best case is probably to ask your library. Do you know if I can access the resources from outside the US? Yes, for the GovInfo and the free Gov. I'm sure you could always buy a subscription to ProQuest. But I think a lot of our libraries, different libraries in the US have different requirements for who can access them. I'm not sure exactly what the access requirements look like for the subscription items outside of the US. But certainly those free ones you should be able to access. Someone asked if there will be a recording. Yes, there will be. Let's see. Um, yes, someone asked to confirm their local library will be able to connect you or a LAR university library. Yes, I would start with your local library. You can usually log into ProQuest yourself from your local library. And then if you find that there are documents you are seeing exist, right? You're looking and you say, there's supposed to be a House report, and I can't find it on ProQuest, and I can't find it on the free government websites. That's a good time to reach out to a law university library and see if they can help you. They're really good at that. That's kind of what they do. And maybe you're just looking in the wrong place, or maybe you don't have access to a full ProQuest subscription. So start with your local library, see what's out there. Try all your resources first, right? Some things are there, some things aren't in different places. And then if you can't find it, um, I have always found my law librarians at my alumni university have been helpful. I don't know that all librarians will be, um, but it's worth trying. Um, Someone asked if law university libraries have free access if you didn't attend the school but work in the legal field. I think it depends on the school. Normally, I've seen that like most subscription services, you can't access them through the university. They're for university students. What you can do is reach directly out to the librarian. Um, if you didn't attend the university, you might be better off trying one of your state law librarians. They may be a better resource, right? Because it's like you're not an alumni. Um, so you can also try that. Um, but the worst that happens is someone says no, right? If you're hunting something down. I'd also try to be respectful of their time, right? Please try always to do the research yourself, especially when we're asking librarians who are serving other populations. But I find that they want to help you find these things so long as you've done your due diligence to start. Um, and I think that finished all the questions. I hope this was helpful. I will send this out. I hope, moving through those was useful. If you run into questions and you want to reach out to me and you're like, I don't remember how you did this, definitely feel free to reach out. I am no expert, I'm no law librarian, but I've spent time just trying to learn how to do it better. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you at our next training.